Blindenton here, and over the past year, I've come to love the Mega Man series. It's home to some of the finest damn platformers I've ever played. But at the same time, I've come to hate the Mega Man series because it's home to some of the worst damn platformers I've ever played. The Classic and X series honestly have too many problems for me to truly consider them all that great. The Classic games are all way too samey, and the X games are extremely inconsistent in quality. And that doesn't even scratch the surface. I just wish there was a Mega Man series that stood out, that didn't drag on for far too long, that was consistently fun to play throughout each installment, that... Wait, you mean that did happen? Enter Mega Man Zero. Released in 2002 on the GBA, Mega Man Zero was developed by Inti Creates, a team comprised of former Capcom employees. Inti Creates had been wanting to create their own Mega Man game for a while, as otherwise they hadn't been very successful. Eventually, Capcom greenlit them to develop their own installment, and Inafune requested they focus the game on the secondary protagonist, Zero. I've also heard multiple times they were the ones who designed Mega Man X2, but from what I've seen, they actually had no involvement. Anyways, Mega Man Zero was meant to follow up from the events of X5, where Zero was killed off for good. At least until X6, in which he's brought back for literally no reason, which forced him to rewrite the plot somewhat, but it's whatever. Mega Man Zero was a pretty huge success. It was the third best-selling game in Japan during its week of release, and by the end of the year it sold nearly 250,000 copies. Reception was super positive, with most reviews praising the game's story, graphics, and new additions to the formula. Its brutal difficulty was mixed among reviewers, but the game was still heavily recommended. It was clearly popular enough to spawn 3 sequels, 2 compilations, an arranged album, and a complete works art book. Published by Noodles? I need this book, and I need it now. As for my experience with Mega Man Zero, I had finished the entirety of the Classic and X series, and then didn't touch anything new for a while. I still replayed the games I loved, but those were far few in between. Then on Earthbound's 25th birthday, the Mega Man Zero ZX Legacy Collection was announced. I was excited for 2 events that day. I really enjoyed playing as Zero in X4, so I was interested in trying out games built more around him. Fast forward to February 25th when the collection dropped, and I sunk my teeth into the first Zero game immediately. I couldn't even put it down, I was obsessed with it. But after 5 playthroughs and examining almost every nook and cranny, how do I feel about the game now? The best place to begin would be with the story. And we began said story with a group of soldiers running away from these Mega Man X-looking motherfuckers. The few that aren't killed off, including their leader Ciel, reach the place that they're looking for, some ancient abandoned laboratory. Inside, they discover the legendary hero known as Zero. He's been asleep for 100 years, and presumably they need to awaken him. Unfortunately, he's protected by an energy field that no one can break through, and the enemies are getting closer and closer. Even Milan is defeated, and the only option left is for Ciel to use the powerful cyber elf Passy to break open the barrier. This would cost Passy's life though, and Ciel is on the fence about it at first, but once the enemies start to corner in, she realizes she has no choice. Passy performs a cyber elf sacrifice in order to break open the barrier. A bright light starts to shine, and Zero is resurrected. Ciel begs for Zero to help her, and despite having just woken up and having no clue what the hell is going on, he grabs the buster of the late Milan and shoots down everything in their path. After reaching a dead end, the floor collapses and Ciel is snatched by a golem. Unfortunately, the buster Zero holds isn't powerful enough to defeat it. All of a sudden, a cyber elf appears to hand him the Z-Saber, which had been last held by X. He defeats the golem in a single swing, which confirms to Ciel that he truly is Zero. Zero, on the other hand, is unable to remember anything and has doubts himself, but he takes Ciel's word for it. The duo transport to the Resistance base, and Ciel explains everything to Zero. A government known as Neo Arcadia was built to maintain peace between Reploids and humans. More recently, though, Reploids were being falsely labeled as Mavericks and killed off. Ciel felt it was unfair, so she escaped Neo Arcadia to build a rebellion against the government and rescue any innocent Reploids. She also reveals that the head honcho of it all is Zero's comrade, Mega Man X, hence why she thought Zero was the only one capable of stopping Neo Arcadia for good and revived him. She requests for him to help out the Resistance, and thankfully Zero accepts. From that point forward, Zero initiates missions to grow the Resistance more and more. Not much really happens during this part of the plot. It's nice to see the base fill with more and more of the Reploids you save though. Plus, some minor details are dropped as well that become important later on, such as Ciel planning to develop a substitute energy to prevent a shortage from ever occurring. You're also introduced to the 4 Guardians during this period. They were created in X's image to protect Neo Arcadia from any opposing forces. There's Harpuya, the leader of the group and commander of the Air Force, Fafnir, the commander of the ground troops, Leviathan, commander of the Navy, and Phantom, commander of the intelligence unit. All 4 will attempt to stop Zero and the Resistance throughout the missions, with Zero winning every single time. Once all the main missions are complete, the base gets attacked. Enemy troops are trying to steal the base's supply of energy. Before Zero can even take off to save the other members though, Ciel confesses that Neo Arcadia was her own creation and she was the one who regenerated X. But not in the same way Zero was resurrected. Ciel runs out of time to explain herself though, so Zero sets off to save the day once again. Afterwards, Ciel thanks Zero for saving the base yet again, but still worries about X's plans. That's when Zero decides to hunt out X for his wrongdoing. Problem is, he has no clue how to reach him. Suddenly, the cyber elf back at the abandoned laboratory let them know he reprogrammed the transfer to allow Zero to transport to Neo Arcadia whenever he wants. He also tells Zero to destroy that clone of his, revealing that this cyber elf is in fact X. As if we didn't see that coming from a mile away, but you know. After trekking through the Shrine and Tower of Neo Arcadia, Zero reaches the Neo Arcadia core. The Guardians attempt to stop him again, but Zero manages to defeat them. Yet again. Phantom even sacrifices himself to try and take Zero with him. Zero finally confronts the end of the base, where the Guardians are still committed to stopping him. All of a sudden, Copy X shows up and commands him to leave. Zero tells him off for his ridiculous idea of peace, but Copy X laughs it off and claims to be superior to the original X. They have a duel which Zero easily wins, which causes Copy X to transform into a Seraph form. Zero defeats his second form without breaking a sweat. He then remembers how the true X was never this naive, which is what made him a hero in the first place. This pushes Copy X over the line, so he self-destructs as a last resort and Zero makes his escape. After the base explodes, we find Zero unconscious in the desert. Cyber Elf X tells him how he's been fighting in the war alone for 100 years and eventually stopped caring about fighting altogether. Now he wants Zero to carry the torch for him as he rests in peace, just for a while. Zero agrees to take X's place. He'll terminate enemies whenever he sees one, which ends the story off with him slicing through a pantheon in the most badass way possible on GBA. I need to commend this story because it is bar none the best in the series up to this point. A majority of Mega Man stories beforehand just fell flat due to either explaining important details poorly, taking things way too seriously, awful translations, lack of build-up or motives, inconsistent continuity, relying on the same plot twist, 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 and did I mention they always rely on the same plot twist? I won't lie, Zero's story isn't perfect either, as not much really happens during the middle and some parts were completely retconned in future games. Aside from that, it's a well-written story for what it's worth and leagues better than what we received before. You don't get to see much of the characters aside from Ciel and Zero, but they're both great. Ciel was willing to risk her life just so she could bring back Zero and aid the Resistance. She's also shown to care for other members and even served as a sort of sister figure to one of them. Zero, on the other hand, kicks ass. He'll help anyone in a crisis, no matter the cause. He didn't question anything when he was revived. He just snatched the nearest weapon and escorted Ciel to safety. All he cares about is defending the ones in danger. He also gives zero craps about nonsense. You better be reasonable with him. The story presentation is decent, but not much else. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just kind of basic. Most of the plot is told within text boxes and characters just stand around without any animation. The mugshots are a neat touch, although it does look like they just scan drawings in. Ciel and other Resistance members will also call you during the mission, similar to Alien X5 onwards. In some way, somehow, they're not even intrusive. What they say can actually be useful here and there. It helps add to the atmosphere if you ask me. Speaking of atmosphere, this is by far one of the darkest Mega Man games. You find corpses of Reploids lying around, some of the Guardians straight up threaten to kill you, the plot is about Reploids being murdered to make humans happier, and in the Japanese release, Reploids and enemies spew out tons of blood. Heck, the disposal center has blood splattered all over the walls. Originally, Copy X didn't even exist and Zero would have been forced to destroy the True X. Ignoring all that, Mega Man Zero's story is surprisingly good for what it is, and it just gets better the further the games go on. For once, a Mega Man game with a story I can genuinely call good. How does Zero fare in audiovisuals though? Graphically, this game is pretty good. That's the most I can really say about it. Don't get me wrong, the sprite work is fantastic. I also love the new art direction for these games, especially when it comes to Zero's redesign. He went from super boxy to super sleek. The backgrounds look bland. They don't really have anything going on in them. The desert is a perfect example. On that note, the location variety isn't the best either. The factory, the abandoned laboratory, the subway, and the disposal center all just kind of blend together for me, and those are half the areas in the game. I'm also convinced 90% of the animation budget went into Zero, as enemies and bosses feel super stiff in comparison. Admittedly, some of the rotation effects they use look cool though. Maybe I'm just spoiled by the future Zero games. And I'll give Zero one credit, it still looks good for the first try. Like Mega Man tradition though, the graphics only get better and better the further the games go on. In most cases, that is. The same can apply for the sound design. The soundtrack is pretty good, and that's the best I can say for it. There's some amazing music, and there's also some that go in one ear and out the other. I will praise them for composing a soundtrack that worked perfectly for the GBA's limitations, especially of how good the instruments sound. There are just certain tracks that sound really generic for Mega Man standards. I will say though, when a song stands out, it really shines. Best examples including the Zero theme, Yuji Express, Hell Plant, Crash, and especially Enemy Hall. The only other point worth mentioning is that the re-releases of Zero One include a remastered version of the soundtrack. I put that in quotations because they're the exact same tunes and higher quality. The songs definitely sound better without the compression you'd find in the GBA version though. The result screen music was a bit different, but aside from that, they're all spot on. The audio visuals are solid, and the story is rock solid. Now, is the gameplay mega solid? Mega Man Zero plays much differently from the classic and X series. The classic games were mostly about platforming, with a dose of combat here and there. The X games evolved the formula with faster-paced gameplay and extra mobility, and starting with X4, Zero was fully playable with a more melee-based approach to fighting. This is the basis for Zero's formula, although this game focuses less on platforming and way more on combat, speed, and precision. The optimal place to start would probably be controls. I have to say, Mega Man Zero controls beautifully. It's similar to the X games where you can dash and wall jump, but I'd be lying if I claimed they ever felt this smooth and responsive. Zero also has this pristine weight to him. He jumps at a perfect arc and he never feels too weighed down, nor like he's in space. Also, is it just me or does Zero handle much faster in this game? My point is, the controls are so fluid, they should never screw you over. Even regarding the fact that this game is stuck on GBA, you also don't feel too limited by controls. You can adjust them to your preference at any time by pausing and clicking R. By default, B is for your main weapon, A is for jumping, L is for dashing, and R is for the sub-weapon. Off the bat, this is a flawless setup in my opinion. I never liked how in the X games, dashing was mapped to the rightmost button as the left trigger just feels more comfortable. With Zero, I'd say they mapped each function in just the right place. On the other hand, I always have to readjust the other control option, which is for weapons. Type A has it so you activate your sub-weapon by holding R and B simultaneously, Type B instead lets you attack with your sub by just clicking R, and then Type C you press R to switch between the main and sub. Type B is by far the best way to play. Being able to utilize both weapons at the same time gives you a huge advantage the other options don't have. I guess Type C is a helpful beginner's choice, but I have no clue why the bloody heck Type A exists or why it's on by default. That brings me into the combat, the most complex aspect of this game. What made Zero so much fun to play as an X4 were his saber combos. Being able to hack and slash through enemies while connecting the blade properly is way more satisfying than necessary. Plus, Zero can learn special moves from the bosses which were activated with simple button combinations. He may have not been perfect, he couldn't attack while running or dashing, and in later games they kept screwing him up more and more. Excessive end lag, slow saber slashes that are hard to connect, broken techniques, and the list doesn't even stop there. Mega Man Zero refined the swordplay in a lot of ways. The 3 saber combos back of course, but Zero can now slash away while running or dashing. He also learns how to use a Kuenzan and can even use it on the ground to roll endlessly. Best of all, he has the ability to charge his saber and unleash a powerful slash. All the attacks feel quick and nimble and they're easy to pull off as well. The only downside is that Zero can't learn any skills from bosses anymore. To compensate for this, however, Zero now has 4 different weapons to choose from. The first one he actually obtains is the Buster Shot, mistakenly called the Z-Buster in this game. In X5 and X6, Zero could utilize his Z-Buster, but only when standing still, and it was really slow and weak. Now in Zero, the Buster Shot is more akin to X's Buster. He can shoot bullets whether he's moving or standing still, while also being able to charge it up 2 levels. To make matters better, not only can it be upgraded to shoot 4 bullets at a time, but charge shots can now penetrate through multiple enemies. A brand new sort of weapon would be the Triple Rod, which you unlock after the Retrieve Data mission. Just like the Z-Saber, it's a melee weapon, except the triple rod has better range. It can also be extended further than that while also dealing extra damage, and you can aim it at any direction. You do lose all momentum when you attack with it, but while aiming downwards, it's possible to pogo hop off enemies. Plus, it can also be charged to dish out a spinning attack that deals multiple hits at a time. I mostly only used it when enemies were above or below me, but it's still a helpful part of Zero's arsenal. Last but not least is the shield boomerang, unlocked after obtaining the triple rod. This reflects most enemy fire back if held up, although it doesn't protect against melee attacks or more powerful shots. You're also unable to dash while using it unless you time your jumps correctly. And while you are able to throw it like a boomerang when charged up, it's not nearly as practical for offense as the other weapons. In particular, this is why I recommend playing with Type B, as you'll be able to attack with a more useful weapon without losing cover too much. There may not be as much quantity compared to before when it comes to weapons, but Zero makes up for it in quality. Weapon selections have always been really iffy, whether it be one weapon that outclasses everything else, or weapons that feel too situational for use in combat, or they're straight up worthless altogether. On the other hand, all 4 weapons in Zero are consistently good and have multiple different functions that make them all worthwhile, even if some may not be used as much. You might assume you'd be missing out on the whole weakness chain that made Mega Man stand out. You'd be wrong though. Now you have elemental chips. This is a more streamlined take on the whole Jonkin formula. In fact, it's like if they took Jonkin way too seriously. You can dish out elemental damage with charged attacks as long as the corresponding chip is equipped. They also have some secondary effects like thunder and ice stunning enemies and fire dealing some extra damage. You could argue they simplified it too much, but with how much utility they added to the weapons, I really don't mind. As if that wasn't enough, there are a plethora of techniques you can pull off with these weapons. Reversal slashes, skull crushes, or even some combos involving both weapons to rack up tons of damage. A couple completely break the game in half though, like this bootleg saber dash cancel. I'm certainly not too well versed with Zero's tech, but it adds more potential ways to defeat bosses aside from spamming weaknesses. What I'm trying to say in general is that the combat in this game is amazing and has a ridiculous amount of depth compared to any other Mega Man formula. Of course, combat on its own doesn't make a Mega Man game, let alone a platformer. Level design is also an integral aspect. In Mega Man Zero, well, the level design gets the job done, but it's nothing I would call special. There just isn't much to say about these stages. You'll see a couple platforming segments here and there, but for the most part you're just fighting enemies on straight shots of land. You won't be seeing many memorable set pieces either. I'm somewhat okay with it since the game does focus way more on combat and speeding through stages. Still doesn't change how unremarkable the level design really is though. What sets these levels apart instead are the missions. No longer is just defeating a boss at the end of the stage your only objective. How about raiding an abandoned lab for data and then escaping as it collapses? Or demolishing a giant mechanoid before it destroys the resistance? Or how about saving prisoners in a hidden base, disarming bombs at a factory, fighting off a barrage of enemies, destroying a computer lab? Have I made my point clear how creative these missions are from those examples? Now, I'm not a fan of every single one. Escorting a soldier slower than Mega Man 4's health bar through a desert isn't what I'd call fun, but the missions help shake up each stage, which is especially good because in this game, you'll be revisiting the same areas again and again. I'm not normally a fan of games reusing levels, as it just feels like padding to me. Despite this, Zero diversifies the levels enough with the missions, so I can cut it some slack. That being said, I really wish the game made it clear which bosses you'll be dealing with, as you're only given the title of your job and your objective. I guess it's also worth noting that the stages are all connected like a Metroidvania. You're not allowed to explore during a mission, but when you're free, you can roam any of the locations you've visited before. You can also freely warp between areas with trance servers. It's an awesome feature that you certainly don't see often in Mega Man games. Plus, I won't go in detail about this now, but it alleviates some of the game's bigger issues. The only gripe I have with the overworld is that I feel like they should have scattered more transporters throughout levels because you'll typically reach a dead end and be forced to backtrack. The only other levels I haven't talked about are Neo Arcadia, which are akin to castle stages in past Mega Man games. These are by far my favorites in Zero. They fulfill my wishes of blending platforming and combat together, and super well at that. You've also got boss after boss to kill, enemies up your ass, some of the trickiest challenges in the game, and spikes. Holy moly, there are spikes everywhere. The final stage is a boss rush, and I can actually tolerate this one. Boss rushes before took way too long to finish and often didn't have anything else going for them. On the contrary, this level offers more than just recycled content, and it splits the boss rush into two. If the rest of the level design was this memorable, then I would have been singing a different tune earlier. Speaking of bosses, those are one of the most emphasized aspects of Mega Man. Too bad the quality of the battles can be all over the place. The bosses in Zero are all pretty consistent, thankfully. In fact, these might be some of the better designed boss fights in the series. A majority of them are reasonably challenging, they all have patterns that are fun to memorize, and they don't feel too underwhelming or too arduous. In most cases, the train and factory bosses drag on for a bit too long admittedly. My favorite battles would have to be Anubis Necromancis and Fafnir. Anubis will summon Pantheon zombies or sand walls out of the ground or even harm you with his cane. Fafnir has a couple super powerful attacks up his sleeve which can be tough to dodge at first, although with the right timing you can leap over him and whittle him down. Once you've figured out their sequence, you should be able to handle them with ease, but that's what makes them enjoyable to learn. In case you're struggling too much against these bosses, the elemental chips are your friend. Charging up an attack with the correct weakness on these bosses takes away chunks of health from them. Even if it causes them to collapse much more easily, I feel like it's a good way of allowing the player to decide how challenging they want the fight. Not to mention, they don't struggle from mindless pattern resets like the X games. We can pretend Harpuya doesn't exist, right? There are a few exceptions I'd like to bring up though. Phantom, while a blast to fight, can cause a bit of a difficulty spike because he has no weakness whatsoever. Then there's Copy X, who has the exact opposite problem. He's a pushover. In the first phase, you can trap him in the corner without much hassle and pulverize him. During phase 2, he has a handful of attacks that might be tough to avoid, but just a few swings with the ice chip kills him. And for being the final boss, I was kind of hoping he'd put up a bit more of a fight. To be honest, most of the Guardian battles were tougher. I said most, okay? Another aspect that enhances the level design are the collectibles, and I don't mean the life energy, which restores health like usual, or the energy crystals, which function as a currency of sorts. I'm talking about the Cyber Elves. You find these adorable bastards scattered throughout missions by either breaking open boxes, destroying an enemy species enough times, or defeating the boss. A handful here and there can also be obtained around the Resistance base. From a collectible standpoint alone, I really enjoy Cyber Elves as they encourage you to search the levels for them and increase replay value. They're not handed to you on a silver platter either, they're often located out of place and might require a basic, albeit clever solution to reach. A couple are excruciating though. These two in Neo Arcadia Shrine specifically, where you pogo hop off these gyro cannons and land on the roof, demand the most precise movement. You might also need to return to certain areas to grab Cyber Elves that were unobtainable during the mission, although I don't mind needing to come back for a few here and there. How about the actual function of Cyber Elves? Well, there are 3 different flavors of elves. Nurse elves, which affect Zero's energy, animal elves that support in combat, and hacker elves that can reprogram enemy or map data. On top of that, there are different criteria for elves. Most of them will only help out temporarily and give small bonuses such as fully healing you, stunning enemies, transforming everything into a metal for Mega Man 7, that kind of stuff. The rare ones on the other hand give you permanent effects. These are the closest to upgrades you'll find in Zero. You'll need to grow these by feeding them energy crystals you collect throughout the game first. Some of the effects include having a boss's energy, boosting your movement speed, increasing your life gauge, or even transforming into sub-tanks. Since this is probably the best time to mention it, the sub-tanks were modified so they only drain the amount of energy you'll need rather than the entire thing like before. Have I made my point clear about how much they improve upon the X formula? Not only do collectibles spice up level design, but so do enemies, which are pretty important for, you know, a game that relies on combat. Zero has pretty decent enemy variety, albeit not as much as most other Mega Man games. You'll notice a lot of the same enemies reused between missions, primarily Pantheon soldiers, which alone have 5 different forms. Although there are a few that only show up in specific areas to fit the theming well, like sand snakes and cameloids in the desert, or shark seals and screwdrivers in the underwater section of the hidden base. The enemy design is still great of course, as they all put up a fight while not being too much of a hindrance. In fact, I'd say they feel a bit more complex than most Mega Man enemies normally do, so that's a plus. I would say the feature that ties the fast-paced platforming and combat of Mega Man Zero together is the ranking system. Now I think this is an awesome concept. It fits the nature of the game with how much it focuses on precision. Plus, I think ranking systems can shape a game together. The player will have to harness their skills and get better at the game so they can receive the best ranks. It's one of the reasons I love playing Sonic Adventure 2 so much in spite of how extremely flawed it really is. Rankings made their debut back in X5, but it was a mess in 3/4. It doesn't explain how you're being ranked at all and the conditions are unreasonable. How the bloody heck are you supposed to pass Duff McWhalen in under 2 minutes? Plus, as far as I'm aware, there's no reward anyways. And true to just about everything else it does, X6 handles it much worse. Now your ranking is tied to how many Nightmare Souls you've obtained. Not only does that go completely against the philosophy of a ranking system, but you'll have to grind for ages to receive the best rank. Moving on to Mega Man Zero, how well does the ranking system work now? Well, let's just step up from how it was in the X games at least. Not saying much though, because it still sucks ass. I'll give it credit where credit is due. Now the game gives you an idea of how to receive the best rank. There are 6 conditions for each level, with mission and clear time giving a max of 20 points and the rest totaling at 15. When all are added up, you receive your final score, which determines your ranking for the stage. You also earn a cool title this time around. Seems fine at first, right? This is where it all starts to collapse. Now, I have nothing against the mission or clear time objectives. Mission just equates to completing a level, and clear time is self-evident. Everything else? Where do I begin? The enemy condition is stupid. It's built around a specific number of enemies you defeat during the stage. How is anyone supposed to figure out the perfect amount they need to destroy? Damage makes sense, but I feel like they could have been just a tad more lenient since you'll be taking a lot of touch damage. I also wish Cyber Elves didn't leave a permanent mark on your score, otherwise they're fine. And then retries, that's a different can of worms, but the amount of deaths you take shouldn't matter. Although my biggest grievance with the ranking system is that instead of your rank being determined by your performance in the mission you played, it's judged by your average score. Meaning, if you played poorly in just one stage, it can completely ruin your chances of ever reaching a higher level. It doesn't help that the game never tells you what your average is. It also means if your average is high, you could receive a good level for a low score. You're either being rewarded for playing poorly or punished for playing properly. I guess on the bright side, rankings don't matter too much in the first Zero game. The only advantages are that bosses will have special attacks, and you can enter the room behind CL and grab a Cyber Elf. The extra boss attacks help increase their difficulty at least, which is especially nice for Copy X. Despite that, while I think the ranking system was an amazing idea, I can't begin to stress how poorly it was executed. Now that my rant against the ranking system is out of the way, I think it's about time I discuss Zero's other major problems. This game has been widely considered the most difficult Mega Man installment. At least that's how Capcom promoted the game back in the day. While I think the bosses contribute to that in a fair way, just about everything else that makes Zero so brutal doesn't stem from good game design if you ask me. There are some serious visibility issues for one. The GBA is infamous for its tiny resolution, and a majority of games suffered from screen crunch. Zero is no exception. Some of these stages love to throw bottomless pits and leaps of faith at you. Prime example being the factory during the log writing segment. If you hop up towards one of these ledges, which you're required to, landing back on these logs is easier said than done. You can barely see them if you hang off the walls. The constant dialogue boxes aren't relieving the pain in any way. I never expected weapon upgrades to actively hinder me. I guess I still need to explain that. A sort of RPG element Zero One has is that weapons level up according to how often they're used. It would be fine and dandy if those level ups didn't include basic attacks the weapon should have started with. By default, you'll be stuck with a single slash, meaning you're prohibited from using the 3-saber combo that made Zero so much fun to play as to begin with until you relearn it. So how does leveling up weapons work? Servoja says, as you may know, the more you use a particular weapon, the more your skill on it will grow up. On my first ever playthrough of Zero, I didn't even unlock every skill despite killing just about everything in my path. As I've discovered from online guides, weapon growth happens through hidden experience given off by enemies when killed. The stronger your attack is, the more experience you earn. If you want to learn a specific skill, you'll need to rely on destroying enemies with the right move enough. As an example, killing enemies with a level 1 charge shot from the Buster will net you the level 2 charge shot. If you were to take them out with regular bullets instead, you'd unlock the ability to shoot 4 bullets at a time first. Doesn't sound so bad, but you have to take out so many enemies before you can acquire a new skill. Meaning the best solution to learning your abilities is to grind. I understand Zero's been asleep for 100 years and it helps tie the story more into the gameplay. It's still not fun to waste time gaining abilities you should have been able to utilize from the start. This isn't even the worst case of grinding in Zero though. I stated before how Cyber Elves with lasting effects need to be fed E-crystals. How many E-crystals? A stupid amount. Often around 1,000, and that's only at their first level. A couple require 2 doses of E-crystals before you can finally use them, and the second time around, they ask for double the amount. To give you an idea of how absurd this is, by the time I finished my first recorded playthrough, I only had around 2,500 crystals. At most, I would have been able to fully upgrade 1 or 2 medium elves. After doing some research, I figured out that in total, you'll need 27,650 crystals to feed every elf. Luckily, this is what makes the overworld so helpful. You're allowed to collect crystals without even entering a mission, so if you really want, you can grind off enemies until you earn enough. What's also convenient is that certain areas, specifically the factory, are littered with E-crystals outside of missions. It's still not enough for every elf, but it's better than replaying the game 13 times. The best place place I found to grind was near the end of the desert with these sand snakes, as they always drop crystals. Within about 10 minutes, I gained about 1,000 or so. Pretty decent number, but if I were to farm enough to afford feeding every elf, I'd need to do that for over 2 hours, maybe 3. You know how many playthroughs of the game I'd be able to complete within that time? 2, maybe 3. Jeez, NES RPGs were more lenient. Believe it or not, those don't even reach Zero's most fundamental flaw. The biggest problem with the first Zero game is something so crucial, yet so simple. You know how in a majority of games, lives are actually worth a damn? Zero took a completely different approach. If you die just once, you'll receive a game over and be asked to retry. Accept the retry and your ass is sent back to the beginning of the level. Unless you defeated a boss or already fought one. Since most of your deaths will stem from bullshit like poor visibility, it's not even worth wasting the retry. Not only because your ranking is affected by the amount you use, but also because retries are super uncommon. They might be lying around in missions occasionally, and once in a blue moon they drop from enemies. Retries aren't even replenished if you lose them all either, so you'll want to hoard them up and save them for the harder missions. If you manage to lose your entire stock, never, and I repeat never, choose the give up option. You'd assume it allows you to put off the mission you're struggling with for a later time, but it instead permanently removes said mission from the list. You have no chance to replay it again. This is especially horrible because certain missions contain the fire and ice chips, so if you didn't know any better, you could easily screw yourself out of the weakness chain. Did I also mention that dying in the overworld counts as a retry? How do you fuck up lives this badly? Well, once you've presumably finished Zero, what are you rewarded with? Bonus modes. You can save over your current file and start New Game Plus, where you retain all your Cyber Elves and E-Crystals. But if you hold down L when starting a new game, you begin Hard Mode. Rather than typical Hard Mode features like buffing enemies or bosses, your weapons will never upgrade. Yeah, because that'll be fun. Believe it or not, it actually is. There's also a special Cyber Elf you unlock after feeding every other elf in the game known as Jackson. He's like Sting Chameleon Jr., his ability allows you to stay temporarily invincible. And if you sacrifice every single Cyber Elf, including Jackson, you unlock the Ultimate Mode, which you activate by holding R on a new game. All upgradable Cyber Elves in effect without penalty, charged attacks without even charging? You can mop the floor in this mode. If you're immune to grinding, these are really sweet prizes for beating the game in different ways. I think I've said just about everything there needs to be said about Mega Man Zero. For their first work on a Mega Man game, I'd say Inti Creates pulled off a rock-solid job. The amazing combat, challenging bosses, Cyber Elves, and mission system all built toward a great new gameplay style. On top of that, the story is super well written for the series standards, and the audiovisuals are decent for an early GBA game. The lack of polish cannot be ignored though. The stage design isn't super remarkable and suffers from severe visibility issues. The ranking system is botched by dumb requirements. The weapons in Cyber Elves require an excessive amount of grinding. And of course, the retries, one of the worst ways to handle lives I've ever seen, period. Every time I glance at this game, the more flaws I start to notice. Heck, while writing and editing this review, I noticed even more problems than when I was playing through the game. It doesn't help that they marketed Zero off its difficulty when most of it stems from poor design. In spite of its issues though, Zero is a huge guilty pleasure for me. I'd honestly take it over half the classic or X games. The formula is fantastic and all it needed was more time to be ironed out. Will the future Zero games manage to do that? We'll just have to see. If you're interested in Zero, I would not recommend picking up the GBA version, unless you're willing to deal with replacing a dead safe battery. Instead, you'll want the Zero ZX Legacy Collection. The collection includes a save assist feature which completely negates the issue of retries. On top of that, there's an abundance of bonus features, including a brand new Z-Chaser mode. Although if you're still struggling with the first Zero game, Zero 2 is probably a better entry point anyways. It's easy to pick up on the story and the overall experience is way more enjoyable. You can pick your poison though. Until next time, this is BlueNin10, realizing I literally just spoiled my inevitable Zero 2 review. Oh well, it was bound to happen.